Okay, hello, how is everyone?
Fine,
Hello.
thank you.
Say hi. Hi for the recording. Hi, recording.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Cubs
Yes.
won.
Hi, future me.
Woo.
You like the Cubs?
Yes, I love the Cubs.
Chicago.
Yes.
Yeah, one time my family forced me to pick it. Are the Cubs baseball?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. In Sinaloa, we have a lot of
They're
baseball.
going to the World Series. Sure. Saturday is the game against the Dodgers, and if they won, they go to the World Series against Yankees.
Which is not has no world in it, right? But
yes, it's only the United States, but
yeah, yeah. Anyway, let's talk about government.
Yeah.
Yes. So,
The thing that I want.
did everyone try to do the questionnaire?
yeah.
Great.
Yes, but I couldn't.
So, we already talked about questions 1 through 3. So today we're going to focus on questions 4 to 8. Now, on the blog post for before we almost forgot. How is everyone doing with the partial project and the partial evaluation?
I'm still having a doubt in how to
Tell me.
put the definition of state building.
Okay, so the part of state building and nation building is exactly what we did on Monday.
Okay.
Except the part of the hurricane and the immigrants. Nation building is how a community becomes a nation. What did they define as what made them a nation? And then state is how they decided who makes decisions and why.
Okay.
So what you need to do is, on Monday it was for a made-up country, but now on the comic you have to do it for a real country.
Okay, but we need to put like a definition of state building and then like type of explain it.
Yes.
Or okay, but we can use like our own definition, like how we will say it.
I mean, the thing is, I find that when students ask me that question, it doesn't mean use my own definition. It means, am I allowed to not understand the concept and use it anyway? So
No.
I would focus on the one I gave you and understanding that and using that.
Okay.
So I'm not saying you have to do what you think like I think, but no need to get confused, right?
Okay.
Teacher,
Yeah. Who's a teacher?
I have a question.
Isabella, tell me. Yes, tell me.
Yeah. In the video, in one of the videos you posted, I think is the one about the Congress of Vienna. The nationalism is mentioned as how people think a nation should be built about their language and all of that. But if you said in your video that nationalism is when the countries act independently, like make their own decisions, what does that has to do with nationalism? Like what
you're asking about the difference between nation and nationalism, or no? You're asking about the definition of nationalism I used and the one Tom Ritchie used.
Yeah.
Right.
So
yeah. So the thing is, they're not completely different. The difference between these two definitions is that he focuses on the ability to form a country, and I make it a little more general and I say act independently. Yeah, because the thing is, acting independently involves a lot of things. Maybe not from the beginning creating your own country, but maybe, for example, seeking autonomy within a country, or maybe trying to support a specific war or something, right? Or maybe wanting to get the right to educate your children in a specific way, maybe in a specific language, like in Catalonia, right? That they were fighting to be allowed to use Catalan in their schools. But Tom Ritchie is focusing on creating a country, which is another way of acting independently. It's another example. So my definition is a little more general because the whole point we're trying to evaluate here is that some nations don't have states, right?
Okay, so you could say that nationalism is they believe not only that a country, but kind of a community with the same shared characteristics can act independently.
Because the definition we're handling of nation is a community when they decide to on certain things like a shared history, a flag, symbols, etc. That's when they become a nation, right? And later on, the nationalism is them as a nation trying to act independently, but not specifically to have a state, right? There's other things that nationalism can do, at least for us, because the thing is, our class is liberalism and industrial revolution, so we are a little more open than Tom Ritchie's class, which is European history, right? And actually, today's class is a good example of that because on Wednesday, we talked about the European concept of a nation state. Now we have to talk about the American point of view, which is very, and we talk about these two viewpoints because in Mexico, we have to deal with both of them, kind of, right? Because we deal with the European perspective because we got all the European influence from Spain, but we also have to deal with the American perspective because after independence, we pretty much only got North American influence, right? And the Mexican government takes things from both. So we need to kind of look at both sides.
Teacher, can I ask you a question totally out of subject?
Yes, you can, Sebastian.
Do you know what's the name of the dad of the Powerpuff Girls?
The name of what?
Like the guy, like el de flores, animales, flores y muchos colores. ¿Cómo se llamaba?
El profesor Neutonio.
Profesor Utonio.
Ese, miro, ese.
Utonio.
Ese, mira. Es usted un amor, gracias.
¿Cómo se llamaban las tres chavas esas?
Las chicas superpoderosas.
Bombón, burbuja y
Bombón, burbuja y belleza.
Por favor.
Yo soy tan viejo que a mí me tocó cuando recién salió esa caricatura y se llamaba Las Chicas Coquetas.
¿En serio?
¿Qué?
Y yo salí una cuarta.
Ya salió el anime.
Ya salió esta la versión anime. Anyway, let's not get distracted. I have a lot of feelings about this, so no distractions. Now, any other questions? Now, in the comic, you basically have to do that, but for a real country, right? That's
the thing that what identifies the people and what identifies.
Yeah, and also how did they become a nation and how did they become a state?
But all of that in a comic.
Yes, and for a real country.
Like, teacher, here I have a kind of a problem. Like, yes. Cuba has like 30 different origin stories. Like,
yes, it does.
So do I just choose the one I like? Or?
That's the thing. You have to use, when you decide on your the definition you're going to use of nation building and state building, that's the one that should guide you towards the one you should focus on.
Another question.
The thing is, if you say a nation is built by sharing a language, then you have to talk about how Cuba came to share a language. But if your definition is that nations are built on shared cultural characteristics, you have to explain how they came to share cultural characteristics.
Yeah, and that's the thing. They don't have, like, it's weird. Cuba.
Yeah.
Teacher.
Yes?
Yep. Yeah. So, nation is kind of like generally the community and state is like the government?
No. I mean, state is the government, but nation is not just the community. Nation is a community that comes together and decides on certain things that they share.
Okay.
As a nation, yeah.
And they decide
because the thing is, think of it this way. Your community is the people you deal with in general and the people you identify with, right? So maybe, for example, you are a tech student, so you identify with the tech community because if you find someone else who's doing prepa in Tec de Monterrey, you're like, we have stuff in common, right? But that's not a nation because a nation has to be people you don't even know, people who are maybe in other communities, but that you share cultural things with.
So like that, it's more like a cultural aspect, the nation.
Yeah, because the thing is, it's the difference between running into someone that's also in Prepa Tech or being in another country and running into someone that's also Mexican, right?
But, for example,
that's the best feeling.
What?
Yeah.
Could the UNAM be a nation? Like they have their own
UNAM?
police? Yes, the UNAM.
No.
They have their own police. They have their own, like.
No, UNAM is an organization, and the thing is, they don't share a culture, right?
Well, kind of, but
no. Do they have a national anthem? Do they have their own language? Do they have a religion?
La forma.
Sure, then, like, ¿cómo se dice esto?
We need to get on with other stuff, you guys.
Yeah.
But I have another question. Is
Yes.
okay. So if Mexico is full of different cultures,
If you have a lot of questions, why didn't you ask me before?
what?
You have a lot of questions. Why didn't you ask me before?
Because I didn't understand the concept of nationalism. Like,
Okay.
just
So what's your question right now?
Explain you.
Isabella, what's your question right now?
like if Mexico is full of different cultures and like that stuff, why are we still a nation if we suppose that we have to share like all the cultures and like that?
That's precisely the reason why the definition we're using here of nation is more general, right? Because it's true, Mexico, you could argue that has a lot of nations inside it. Some people even say that, for example, the north of Mexico is a different nation in terms of culture than the south of Mexico. And I've experienced it when I'm from Sinaloa. If I go to Veracruz, I sometimes don't even understand words people are saying, right? And some would say that's because you're a different nation. But does that mean Veracruz and Sinaloenses want to be a different nation, a different country? Not necessarily. So that's why our definition is more general.
Okay.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay. Anyone else? Now, any questions about the UNODC video?
The what?
No, ours is really cool.
Good. We need it to be cool because it's going to be a playlist that we're going to share with Steph.
You're gonna like it.
Make me proud, please.
Does it have a max runtime that we can get past, or can we?
3 minutes.
Oh, okay.
Maximum.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Me faltó maldad, hubiera dicho 2 horas. Un largometraje. Anyway, let's get on with today's topic. Super exciting. Because now we're going to talk about the American perspective. But before that, let's bring up the topic of a very specific Tom Ritchie video where he talks about absolutism versus constitutionalism. Yes?
Yeah.
Everyone watched that video?
Yeah.
Okay, so tell me.
I like his voice.
Me too, I like his accent.
He likes a foreign accent. That is pretty cool.
He's from Alabama. Okay, so what are the characteristics of absolutism?
That is just one person who is in the head of the government. And they don't have
Okay, very good, Diana, very good.
opinion of the rest of the people.
And they don't have a moral code to follow rather than themselves.
Okay, before we get into that, let's talk about the characteristics of the government. We're not talking about legitimate states or de facto states, right? So Diana kindly told us there's one person in charge of government power and there's no representation. So what does this mean in practice?
It's monarchy.
Yes, the king is the one who says if he wanted to have more taxes, he could do it because nobody else was going
So how does taxation work if there's no representation?
In arbitrary way.
Okay, well, more
wait.
laws are arbitrary.
Oh yeah,
Right.
arbitrary.
That means there's no guidelines they have to follow. They can go in any direction. Taxes, how do they work? How do they define taxes?
Decree.
Yes, by decree. Now, what is the difference between taxes by decree and taxes by proposal?
Because you ask them, like, would you like to pay taxes?
Yeah.
Yes.
So in a system where taxes are done by decree, the king says, guys, there's a new tax on headphones. Sorry about it. Can you guys be like, no, we don't like this?
No, we can't.
Not at all, right? You have to be like, well, okay, fine. Now, sovereignty. How does sovereignty work?
Well,
The sovereignty was in
the monarch is the one who is doing everything.
Yes, basically.
I remember, what does sovereignty mean?
It means
soberanía.
not a sentence. It means kind of how who decides how a country acts.
Oh.
Right? So in Mexico we say la soberanía es de la nación, and who's la nación?
Us.
The
Us.
people.
The
nation
people,
is the people.
technically, right? So when the sovereignty is in the monarch, who makes decisions?
The monarch.
Right? Very good, very good. Oh, this was quick. Very good. Now, when we talk about the other one, constitutionalism, how does government power work?
Like it's distributed along many like offices.
It's distributed, and also what?
They justify their actions.
That we're not talking about that yet.
Okay.
No, government power. Who has? Now, can the government do whatever it wants?
No.
Limited.
Limited. Very good. Limited. Now, it's limited by what?
Limited
By a
By
constitution.
the
By
Constitution.
Constitution, right? Now, the entire point of a constitution is that countries or more nations get together and decide that certain things are not negotiable. Certain things are there to stay and cannot be changed, right? Now, the thing is, in theory, this is how constitutions work, but the Mexican constitution does not work like that, because it's actually, in Mexico, our constitution is super complex and super flexible, but we'll talk about that later.
It's limited by who?
The Constitution.
The constitution.
Constitution.
Okay? Now, how do laws work?
Laws are like set
Well, we are
and they
common.
are
Or what?
That they have a group of people who decide how the laws are going to be like. It's not like the absolutism that just one person says, okay, now you're going to wear like this. There's a lot of people deciding how they want to wear and being comfortable with the decision. Well,
yeah, very good.
They are justified most of the time.
Yeah, so in a constitutional government, could someone be like, could a president be like, you know, our new national anthem is gonna be Poker Face by Lady Gaga?
Oh, Kelly, mine.
Would everyone be like, well, okay, he's the president, he said so?
No,
Not at all. Congress, specifically Congress, would be like, no, stop, cannot do that, no, right?
Yeah.
Now, how does taxation work? By decree?
No.
By
Agreement.
By what?
Agreement.
Yeah, good way to put it. What does that mean, though?
I want to have a nice house, and if it gets destroyed, who is gonna help me? So I'm gonna pay the government to give me insurance.
No, but that's
No,
not
it
what I'm
works
asking.
like as
that's-
well as a loss. There is a group of
Uh-huh.
people who says, okay, if my people doesn't is not rich, I cannot ask them for a lot of money.
Yeah, very good.
So they decide.
Yeah, the government is like, hey guys, let's put a new tax on Windows. And maybe people are gonna be like, no, we don't want that tax, right?
Yeah.
Happened literally in Mexico.
And also I think that the government has to give an explanation. It's so necessary. For example, in Ecuador, when was the earthquake, the tsunami thing, I don't remember, was last year.
It was both.
Started to ask for taxes to reconstruct, all the they start to ask taxes, and people couldn't say really like, no, we don't want, because it was a necessity.
Yeah. So, now this leads us into how
what's the name of that thing.
Is there representation in a constitutional government?
No, it's like, because
Yes, there is.
There's a specific name for that, because that here is like common. If a group of people said, no, we don't want those taxes, they cannot ask for those taxes. But if those taxes are necessarily, does that have
but that's another thing. Don't get confused. We're not talking about legitimate and de facto states. We're talking about absolute and constitutional governments.
Okay.
Okay.
I say taxes are by agreement because government can propose putting a new tax, but people could accept it or could reject it,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
they will get an agreement.
Yes,
It's weird,
excellent
like,
explanation.
Puebla, all the houses have small windows because of the
Now,
tax.
yeah, a lot of old houses don't have windows, or they have their windows disguised as doors, right? Now,
I have one question.
yes,
Does
who's talking?
me, Isabella?
Okay.
Isabella.
Does a state that is constitutional can be a facto state?
Yes, we'll talk about that in a minute. Don't get confused.
For example, a big
yes,
question, like
yes,
like a communist state.
uh-huh.
Is it an absolute state or a constitutional state?
We'll talk about that later. One sec. Let's get through this first.
Okay.
If we get off topic, someone in the group is gonna be like, no entendí nada. So bear with me. Yes. So now we were talking about taxation, and Diana was talking about how and Pamela also told us about how taxes need to be agreed upon, right? Now, who would agree on them? How does representation work?
It works by, yeah, but no, well,
Representation, they are not.
It's going to represent them. It's not like the divine right and all that kind of stuff. It's gone. Like now, people is going to say, okay, I like Peña Nieto because nothing, and he's going to choose for my country.
Okay, very good. So there are people representing other people in the government, right?
Teacher, I have a question. But in that, people in that context refers to like the elite, like the nobility and the church.
In what context?
And when you say people are represented in government,
no.
I remember. No.
No, it means people are elected to the government and have to represent the people who voted for them. Yeah. Now, this leads us into where is sovereignty?
In the people.
Is in the people. Now, the question here is, depending on the case, it changes on who is the people, right? We'll talk about that in a minute. Now, the issue here is absolute governments and constitutional governments are things that states are, right? It's part of what they are. But de facto and legitimate states is not what they are, it's what they do.
Yeah.
You understand the difference?
Is what they what?
Think of it this way. Again, absolute and constitutional governments is what governments are. But de facto and legitimate states is what governments do. Now, think of it this way. It's one thing to be a woman, but it's another thing to dress up like a woman and pretend to be a woman, like a drag queen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So one thing is what you are, another thing is what you do. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So absolute governments and constitutional governments, it's what they are. If they have an absolute monarchy, they're an absolute government. If they have a constitution, they're a constitutional government. However, that does not directly mean they're either de facto or legitimate.
Oh, yeah. I got it.
Now,
absolute government tends to be de facto. No?
Now, would you say an absolute government can be legitimate? Yes or no, and why?
Absolute government?
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
it can be legitimate?
No, it couldn't. No. The constitutional...
Why do you answer the question without hearing it?
Yeah, sorry, I'm kind of sleepy.
Improvisando, así, no escucho la pregunta.
Improvisando. Andando como siempre.
I think the absolutism government is not legitimate because, like, if they want to reach something, they will do it. Like, they won't hear the people, they won't hear anybody. Like, they just going to take the decision and that's it.
No, and the issue here, the problem here is it's one person in charge. And yes, we're going into the territory of political philosophy. And in political philosophy, you have to consider all possible scenarios, even if they have never happened. So the issue is one person is in charge, and maybe you could have this one person in charge being very focused on morality, super ethical, super conscious of empathy and of their duty towards the people. But at the same time, is morality something you can do individually, or is it something that has to do with a lot of people? Exactly, right?
It's a lot of people.
Yeah, exactly. So the thing is, maybe this one person is super morally inclined, but at the same time, if they really believe that something has to be done, they're going to do it. Doesn't matter. There's no way to shift their focus, right? So we could say that an absolute government is always de facto, right?
Yeah.
Now, similarly, in a constitutional government, having a constitution, does it necessarily mean you are legitimate?
No.
No.
Because I believe Sebastián Robledo brought this up earlier, right? How some countries, nowadays all countries have constitutions, but are they all legitimate?
No, because we have,
like I was talking, like for example, the Soviet Union, it wasn't one person in charge. It was like, it was supposed to be like elected, and there was kind of
it was pretty much one person in
moral
charge.
code. And
no, the thing is, yes, it was pretty much one person in charge. They had their dictator, but at the same time, they had a constitution and they had a government structure that was not absolute, right? Yeah.
yeah.
The thing is, could we say that because it has a constitution, it's always morally focused?
No.
Not necessarily, right? Because there are governments that have constitutions and they have representation or whatever, but at the end of the day, maybe they're not doing things for moral reasons, right? So we could say that a constitutional government is sometimes legitimate, sometimes de facto, right?
And is there a way to make it always legitimate?
Well, that's a big question. A lot of people would say it's about having a government that is constantly reevaluating itself.
Teacher, so our country is ruled by that, right? Like
by
it's constitutionalism, but it's sometimes legitimate.
Yes, because this is where the difference comes in. It's one thing to be constitutional. Mexico has always been constitutional. There has never, well, right after independence under Iturbide, there was a time when Mexico did not have a constitution, but in general, but it was like less than a year. Well, no, it was like 3 years. The first constitution, 1824. So look, maybe we could say from 1821 to 1824, Mexico was absolute, an absolute monarchy. But if it has a constitution, does that mean it's legitimate?
No.
Not necessarily, right? We had dictators, we had wars, we had two governments at the same time at some point, right? So
we had an emperor.
We had a couple of emperors, right? A very liberal emperor, that's a topic for another day, but still, it depends. That's where it comes in. Mexico was always constitutional, but was it always legitimate?
No.
Not really. Now, when we talk about what we just did is we defined the concepts. We kind of went over Tom Ritchie's table. Now we have to apply it to the United States in 1866, so right after the American Civil War, and France in 1714. So way before the French Revolution, during the absolute period of Louis XIV. Yeah? So, France in 1714, was it absolute or was it constitutional?
Absolute.
Definitely absolute. Now, the thing is, it's one thing to define the concept and be like, so government power works like this, etc. But when we apply it, we have to show what in France made governments have one person in charge. So how do you apply it?
Like government power, there was a king.
Who was in charge?
The king.
What king?
Louis
Louis the 14th, right? And he has a very famous quote. Anyone know what it is?
Yeah, el Estado soy yo.
I am the state.
L'état c'est moi. The state is me. El Estado soy yo, etc. Now, what does that mean?
That it was absolute.
Not that, what?
Que sin él no existía el gobierno de
English.
Él es el Estado. Yes.
What?
So, like he was this, like if he stopped ruling, the entire government of his country collapsed. So there would
Basically,
be
yeah.
no state. So,
Yeah, very good. Basically, the entire government depends on his figure, and well, his person, not his figure as in figure, but his role, right? Now, if you want to look at another example of this, it's have you seen my video about Denmark? It's from Ligas y Charolas.
The corruption?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah,
Yeah?
it's in Spanish. It's
No,
not
it's
about the
also
class,
one
but it's
of
another
life.
example of this.
Yes.
Now,
But it's not corruption, girl.
yeah,
Oh.
yeah, that's another good video about this. But the thing is, in absolutism, it's one person in charge. Laws were arbitrary, so it means Louis XIV was the one that made laws, right? He invented the ancien regime because he wanted to, because he thought it made sense, right? He taxed the entire population, but not the nobles because he decided to, right? There was no representation, no Congress, no parliament, no Estates General. And in general, France, the country, did what Louis XVI, the monarch, what the monarch wanted. Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any questions?
No.
Yeah.
Now, on the other side, we have the United States of America in 1866. So after the American Civil War, slavery is illegal. Yeah? Now, it's constitutional, definitely, right?
Yeah.
Now, why? So it's limited by the Constitution. How are laws discussed and rejected or approved?
By Congress.
Congress, correct. Same thing with taxes. Now, how are people represented in the government?
In parties.
Political parties, right? Now, does every person count? Is everyone represented?
No.
No. Are Black people represented?
No.
No, they're not. So the thing here is we have to make a very clear differentiation between how slaves were treated, which is they were completely excluded from the government, not taken into account as human beings or as citizens. So naturally not allowed to vote. Now, were women taken into account in the government?
No.
Yeah.
Well, sort of, but not.
What?
Not at all. Like not completely.
Who's talking?
Me.
Isabella, what were you saying?
That they were kind of considered, but not completely.
Uh-huh. So how were they kind of considered? Did you watch the video about the women in the 19th century?
Yeah.
No.
Something
It's a
similar.
good one. It's a good one.
I saw half of the video.
Uh-huh. It's a good one. So how were they counted?
For example, in the they can make kind of some organizations, or they took women for the alcohol laws and all of that.
So women were allowed to work. They were allowed to organize politically, right? Now, they had access to education and health services, mainly because it made sense that they were raising the men who made all the decisions. So you couldn't have just ignorant women raising the men who would be in charge of a morally directed government, right? So women had obligations towards the government, but at the same time, how were they? And also they were taken into account for the population of states, because remember, the Chamber of Representatives was dependent on the population of the states. Yeah?
Yeah.
So they were taken into account in all these ways, but what was the one thing they could not do?
Vote.
Vote, right? Does this make sense?
They didn't have any property.
Yeah, because voting was based on property. Women were not allowed to have property, so they were not allowed to vote. Now, does this make sense?
No.
No.
And the thing is, here, when we go into questions 6 and 7, the very important thing to do is to take into account the context, right? So, judging from today's standards, today, right now, that we have human rights, we have STEP and UNODC telling us that slavery is completely wrong and there's no way around it, right? We have a bunch of garantías individuales and stuff like that. Right now, could we have a state that allows slavery and prevents women from voting?
No.
Not at all, right? Because nowadays we have standards that say that kind of thing makes a state not legitimate, right? But back then, was it the same way?
No.
Why not?
because at that time black people didn't like count as really people, and women were considered as inferior and like dumber, and they would mess up the entire political system. So,
but the thing is, it's one thing to be considered inferior but still be taken into account, and it's another thing to not even be considered part of the system.
Yeah.
Right? So when we talk about was the United States a legitimate state while slavery was legal in certain states, we have to take into account whether if by excluding this group of people, they're still allowed to be legitimate.
Well, that is the thing. Like it says here, sovereignty is in the people, but who is the people? Like if you define the people as rich white males, then yeah, it is a legitimate state.
Yes, exactly. Or if you define it as rich white males who have obligations towards the government and own property, right? Then the thing is, if you're excluding all these people and they're not part of the people, then can you be legitimate? Can you still say we're doing things morally here?
Yes.
It depends on context, right? So back then,
the correct answer to that question would be depending on the context.
Depending on the context, but you need to make a judgment. You need to say yes or no, and that's up to you. But the thing is, you have to be very clear on the difference between completely excluding a group of people, so they are not part of the people, and with women where they are part of the people, but at the same time, they're kind of kept behind certain restrictions that don't really make sense in that context.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, a huge thing here is that in legitimate states, we have to constantly ask ourselves if we're actually doing the right thing. That's the issue with legitimate states, that they are never stable because things are always changing, because people are always deciding that that different things are what's good, what's morally correct, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So when we talk about that, think I'm not saying sexism is worse than racism. Not saying that. What we're talking about here is the difference between excluding an entire group of people and completely excluding them, or between kind of excluding them and not being very, what's the word? Congruent? Is that a word?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm not sure if it's a word in English or if it's too fancy of a word, but you know what I mean, right?
It's coherent or something
coherent,
like that.
Yes, coherent. Thank you. Finally, well, any questions? That's kind of the discussion around that.
Yeah, but like in question, you skip question 5.
Question 5?
No, nothing. Yeah, it goes from 4 to 6. I just realized.
Because question 4 is the United States and question 5 is the Kingdom of France.
Oh, so like here, we just have to justify what kind of government. Yeah, sorry, here in the chart, like in the question 4 chart, we have to justify what kind of government and laws and compare them between the United States.
Yes, in the chart you have to explain. You have to tell me who was the one in charge, what kind of laws, what kind of taxes, you need examples, that kind of thing.
Okay, and 4 lines means like...
Yes. Yeah, so you have space for like a sentence and a half. Yeah, it doesn't have to be super detailed.
Okay.
Okay, and finally, question 8 is super easy, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Yeah, because we talked about this in class, right? About how there were disagreements about how to handle this state building process in the United States. Now, the thing is, we have to make the very clear difference that in Europe, state building was about dealing with a lot of other actors, dealing with a lot of other countries, and how some of them might be more powerful. Maybe you need to agree that not everyone has to be powerful, or you need to make someone more powerful to maintain the peace. But in the United States, they're kind of not dealing with other states. They're just dealing with themselves and deciding how to do things. Yeah?
Yeah.
So those are different concepts of how a nation state is built. Yeah?
And and the Civil War was the result of like...
of the disagreement.
To close the government and trying to open it and trade and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, pretty much. Any questions? Luz, are you okay?
Yes.
I see you in zombie mode.
Everybody's in zombie mode right now.
Not that early, come on.
No, but it's the end of the week. Come on.
In one of my other classes, there was someone on their in the classroom, but on their phone like this on the camera. And I was like, come on, I can see you. But yeah, any questions?
No.
All clear. Now, next week, we are going to use the classes on Monday and Wednesday to work on your projects, okay? So we show up here, and maybe I'll divide you into teams or you work individually, but we're going to focus on that, okay?
Okay.
Okay. See you on Monday. Have a good weekend. Rest up.
Lo de,
Yes,
lo de
please.
Science que había que entregar para hoy, porque lo de Classroom